I stood in my own kitchen, hands trembling as I pulled the cobbler from the oven. The one recipe my mother handed down to me. The one dish that still felt like mine. Through the doorway, I heard my daughter-in-law laugh, her voice sharp as glass. "Stay out of the kitchen," she said. "You old parasite." My son heard her. He looked at the floor and said nothing. That silence echoed louder than the insult. So I served the cobbler, uneaten, washed the plates, untouched, and the next morning I rewrote my will. Because if I'm a stranger at my own table, then he'll be one in my legacy. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The brunch table glowed with late morning sunlight, every dish steaming, every glass of mimosa fizzing with tiny gold bubbles. Maggie adjusted a folded napkin at her place setting, pretending not to notice the way her hands shook. She had woken up early, hours before anyone else, to make sure the cobbler was perfect. Fresh peaches, just enough cinnamon, the crumble topping baked to a golden crust. It was the one recipe her mother had passed down, the one dish everyone still associated with Maggie instead of her daughter-in-law. For a moment, it felt almost like family again. Laughter bounced across the dining room, plates clinked, and the smell of bacon and syrup lingered in the air. Scott poured more champagne into his glass than orange juice, like he always did. And Lindsay leaned over, laughing too loud at one of her own jokes. Sadie, only 11, sat at the edge of the table, humming softly as she poked at her pancakes with the tip of her fork. Maggie stood, brushing crumbs off her skirt. "I'll grab the cobbler," she said brightly, too brightly, and headed toward the kitchen. The oven door creaked when she opened it, the blast of heat fogging her glasses. She slid on an oven mitt and reached for the baking dish when a shadow filled the doorway. Lindsay. She didn't enter so much as occupy, pressing her hip against the edge of the counter like she owned the kitchen, which, technically, she did now. A faint smirk tugged at her lips. "Stay out of the kitchen," Lindsay murmured, voice low enough that the clatter of silverware in the dining room covered it. She tilted her head, eyes glinting. "You old parasite." Maggie froze, mitt still clutching the hot handle of the cobbler dish. The insult landed harder than the oven's heat against her face. Her heart jumped, stumbled, then pounded as if to answer. From the dining room came Scott's laugh. Then a sudden hush. Maggie turned her head slightly and caught him in the corner of her eye. He had stopped in the doorway, plate in hand, having heard every word. His gaze flicked from Lindsay to Maggie, then sank downward to the hardwood floor. He said nothing. Sadie had crept up behind him, her small frame half hidden by the door frame. Wide-eyed, she clutched her glass of milk in both hands, as though it were something fragile and living. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. The silence pressed harder than Lindsay's smirk. Maggie swallowed and set the cobbler down on the counter with more force than she intended. The ceramic dish rattled. She forced her hands to steady, smoothing the mitt against her apron like everything was normal. Like her daughter-in-law hadn't just branded her useless in her own son's home. "Everything okay in here?" Scott asked finally, but his voice was flat, rehearsed, like he already regretted asking. "Of course," Lindsay answered smoothly, sliding a strand of hair behind her ear as though nothing sharp had just left her lips. She even laughed, soft and airy, the sound that had once charmed him into thinking she was sweet. Maggie didn't trust her voice to hold, so she said nothing. She lifted the cobbler again, heavier than before, and walked past them, refusing to let Lindsay's smirk be the last thing she saw. When she set the dish on the table, Sadie slipped into her chair without a word, still staring at her grandmother like she had seen something important, but didn't understand how to name it yet. Scott followed, still looking at the floor, and Lindsay, calm and glowing, sat down beside him, reaching for his glass as though she belonged to him more than anyone else ever could. The cobbler sat in the center of the table, untouched. Its steam curled upward, carrying the sweetness of peaches into the air, but nobody reached for it. The laughter was gone. Maggie lifted her fork, but her appetite had vanished. What lingered instead was heat, not from the oven, but from deep inside her chest, slow and steady, smoldering like embers waiting for oxygen. And as Lindsay dabbed her lips delicately with a napkin and flashed the same smirk she had served in the kitchen, Maggie realized she'd been handed her oxygen. The fork never touched Maggie's lips again. She pushed the cobbler to the side, its steam cooling into silence as conversation fumbled and trailed off around the table. No one said aloud what had been heard in the kitchen, but every glance carried it like static. Lindsay carried on as if nothing were broken, dabbing her mouth, reaching for another pour of champagne. Scott focused on his plate, cutting bacon into precise squares, chewing as if methodical chewing could drown out cowardice. Sadie's fork clinked once against her bowl. She caught Maggie's eye, but the girl looked away just as quickly, embarrassed by her own sympathy. Maggie excused herself halfway through the meal, claiming she'd forgotten to switch off the laundry. No one protested. In the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, staring at the untouched portion of cobbler she had meant to serve with pride. Its golden crust mocked her now. Proof of her effort. Effort wasted on people who didn't want her. She scraped her plate into the sink. By evening, the house was quiet again. Scott and Lindsay had driven off, their laughter trailing through the driveway like exhaust. Sadie waved from the car window, her small hand pressed to the glass longer than necessary. Maggie watched until the taillights disappeared, then closed the front door against the dark. It was nearly 8 when the doorbell rang. Maggie started. Few people came by unannounced anymore. But when she opened the door, warmth rushed in. "I brought you that lemon pie you like," Inez said, stepping inside before Maggie could protest. A neighbor for 20 years, and more a friend than anyone else in her life now, Inez had a way of showing up when Maggie needed someone most. The kitchen smelled faintly of sugar and scorched peaches. Inez set the pie down on the counter and studied her friend's face. "You've been crying," she said softly. Maggie's voice cracked. "She called me a parasite." The story poured out. Every word Lindsay had sliced her with. Every silence Scott had offered instead of protection. By the time Maggie finished, her chest felt raw, hollowed. Inez leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, face unreadable. "What are you going to do?" Maggie dried her hands on a dish towel, the answer already forming, not from impulse, but from a long, steady burn that had finally found air. She met Inez's gaze. "I'm going to stop feeding people who bite me." The room seemed to tighten around the words. Maggie turned toward the cabinet above the refrigerator, pulling down a weathered manila folder. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age this time, but from purpose. She opened it on the table, sliding out a thick set of documents. Her trust papers, written years ago when she still believed in Scott's loyalty. The names glared up at her. Scott Whitaker and Lindsay Whitaker, co-beneficiaries. Inez exhaled through her nose. So she's not just after the kitchen. She's after everything. Maggie pressed her palm flat against the paper as if she could smother the ink back into nothing. Not anymore. They sat in silence, the only sound the tick of the wall clock, until Maggie pushed the folder aside and reached for Inez's pie. She cut 2 slices, forcing herself to taste lemon on her tongue. Something bright, something new. When Inez left, the house settled again into its old creaks. Maggie turned off the lights and climbed the stairs. Her body heavy, but her mind oddly sharp. The trust papers lay spread across the kitchen table, waiting like witnesses. The next morning, when Maggie shuffled into the kitchen, she found a neon pink sticky note stuck to the refrigerator door. The handwriting was jagged, pressed too hard into the paper. "I liked your cobbler. I'm sorry, Sadie." Maggie stood there barefoot on the cold linoleum, clutching the note between her fingers. The words bled into her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She pinned it back against the fridge with a magnet, stepping away slowly, her eyes fixed on the childish scrawl. For the first time in months, Maggie smiled, not because she felt comfort, but because she knew she finally had a reason worth fighting for. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of scent Maggie associated with permanence. Edwin Crane sat across from her, his spectacles perched low on his nose as he scanned the folder she'd placed before him. His fingers were square and slow, flipping pages deliberately, never rushing. The desk lamp threw a warm cone of light across the documents, illuminating words that once felt unshakable. Living trust, health directives, durable power of attorney, Edwin murmured, tapping each page as if cataloging artifacts. All signed and notarized 10 years ago. Scott and Lindsay Whitaker named as co-beneficiaries, joint executors. Maggie folded her hands tightly in her lap, the veins along her knuckles showing pale blue. Her throat felt dry, but her voice didn't waver. Time to make some edits. She's out. He can follow if he chooses. Edwin raised an eyebrow, the kind of expression that invited explanation, but didn't demand it. He'd known Maggie long enough to understand when silence had weight. Still, his pen hovered over the legal pad. And who steps in? Inez, Maggie said. She's been here. She'll keep being here. That counts more than blood. The pen scratched across the paper. Edwin adjusted his glasses. That covers the directives. What about medical authority? In an emergency? Not Scott, Maggie cut in. Her voice came sharper than she expected, but she didn't soften it. He already chose not to protect me once. He doesn't get the chance to fail again. For a moment, only the low hum of the office heater filled the room. Then Edwin nodded, jotting a note. I'll draft the revisions. By the time Maggie left, the winter sky outside had darkened, the street lamps humming faint orange over the sidewalk. She carried the folder under her arm as though it were newly alive, pulsing with her decision. Back home, she stood in the kitchen, staring at the cabinets that had once been her kingdom. Every dish, every heirloom spoon, every casserole pan carried stories of family dinners, Christmas mornings, birthdays with frosting smudged across faces. Now those stories felt looted. One by one, she opened drawers, pulling out what mattered most. Her mother's rolling pin, smooth from decades of pie crusts. The cast iron skillet that had outlasted 3 stoves. A faded blue apron with embroidered daisies, worn at the edges. She wrapped each in tissue paper, sliding them into a box that she pushed beneath her bed. When Sadie visited the next afternoon, Maggie intercepted her in the hallway. The girl still smelled faintly of crayons and bubble gum. Maggie pressed the rolling pin into her hands, wrapped in a towel. Sadie's eyes widened. Grandma, what if Mom finds out? She won't, Maggie whispered, kneeling to meet her granddaughter's gaze. This isn't hers to find. It's ours. Sadie clutched the bundle tight, as if it were treasure. For a flicker of a moment, Maggie saw in her the same spark she'd felt reading that sticky note on the fridge. Loyalty in its purest form. Later that evening, Inez sat at Maggie's kitchen table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. The trust papers, marked with Edwin's notes, lay between them like a chessboard in mid-play. Edwin's question had lingered in Maggie's head all day. Do you want to leave anything to Scott? She traced the rim of her mug, then answered aloud to no one in particular. Not with her attached. Inez set her cup down with a quiet clink. Then bake your legacy, Maggie. Leave crumbs only for the right ones. Not everyone deserves a seat at your table. The words struck deeper than Maggie expected. Bake her legacy. Not just remove Lindsay, but shape something new. Something Sadie could inherit without shame. Maggie stood, walking to the refrigerator. Her granddaughter's sticky note still clung to the door, bright and defiant against the white enamel. She pressed her fingers to it, then looked back at Inez. You're right, she said. Not everyone deserves it. But as the house creaked in the settling night, Maggie knew the real battle hadn't begun. Taking Lindsay off the paper was only ink and signatures. Taking her out of the family, that would demand something fiercer. The envelope lay on the counter, creamy white with Scott's hurried handwriting across the front. Inside was an invitation scrawled on lined paper. Dinner this Friday. Lindsay wants to host. Bring your cobbler. Maggie read it twice, her jaw tightening with each word. Bring your cobbler, as if her worth began and ended with a dish, as if the insult in the kitchen had never happened. She picked up a pen and flipped the paper over. Her reply was brief, written in steady block letters that surprised even her. Won't be home. Make other plans. No apology, no explanation. She slid it back into the envelope and left it propped against the salt shaker, knowing Scott would collect it when he swung by for his forgotten golf clubs. That Friday, instead of setting a table in her own house, Maggie reserved a booth at Finch's Cafe, the place she and her late husband had frequented years ago. The waitress recognized her instantly. Been a while, Mrs. Whitaker, she said warmly, setting down a single menu. Table for one. For one, Maggie confirmed. Her voice didn't tremble. She ordered the chicken pot pie, flaky crust steaming as it arrived, and ate every bite slowly, savoring each forkful. For once, no one interrupted her. No smirk across the table, no silence where there should have been defense. Just her meal, and the soft clatter of strangers living their lives nearby. When she left, the air outside was crisp. Inez was waiting by the lamppost, bundled in a scarf, her smile quick and genuine. You look lighter, Inez said, as they fell into step along the sidewalk. Maggie glanced down at her hands, surprised at how true the words felt. Maybe because I didn't have to serve anyone tonight. They walked in companionable silence, shoes crunching on the gravel path. Maggie thought of Lindsay's voice, sharp and smug, and for the first time, it felt smaller, shrinking. The next morning, Maggie loaded half her recipe books into a cardboard box. She carried them to the community center down the street, where volunteers were gathering donations. She ran her hand over the spines one last time. Church suppers of the South, pie for every season, heritage bakes. She set them on the counter, smiling at the young woman who logged them in. Someone will use these, Maggie said. Better than letting them collect dust. Walking back home, her kitchen felt emptier but freer. Space to breathe, to redefine what belonged to her and what didn't. That evening, as the house settled into its quiet rhythm, the red light on her answering machine blinked. Maggie pressed play. Sadie's voice, thin and wavering, filled the room. Grandma, I miss cooking with you. Mom says I shouldn't call, but I wanted to. I miss the way it used to be. Maggie closed her eyes, gripping the counter edge until her knuckles ached. Sadie's words weren't a plea. They were a tether, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fracture. Later, Maggie sat at her writing desk with a fresh sheet of stationery. She dated the top corner carefully, then began. Dear Sadie, if you're reading this, you've turned 21. You'll understand by now that families can break in ways no one expects. But love, real love, finds its way through the cracks. What I leave you isn't just recipes. It's proof that you come from a line of women who survived worse than smirks and silence. Remember this: what you feed people shows what you think they deserve. Feed wisely. She signed her name in careful cursive, folded the letter, and sealed it in an envelope marked Open at 21. She tucked it into the locked drawer of her dresser, her hands steady. As she slid the drawer shut, the phone rang again, jarring in the quiet. Maggie reached for it, hesitating. What if it was Sadie again? What if it was Scott? What if it was Lindsay, furious at the message she'd sent? Her pulse quickened. She lifted the receiver slowly, bracing for whichever battle was on the other end. Mom. Scott's voice on the other end of the line carried a hesitation Maggie hadn't heard since he was a boy, caught lying about homework. Are you changing your estate? Maggie set the receiver against her shoulder, staring out the kitchen window where the winter sun slid across the frozen yard. She could see his reflection in her mind, jaw tight, hands fidgeting like he always did when a question cost him something. You watched her mock me, she said evenly, and you said nothing. Mom, I was trying to keep things smooth. Her laugh came sharp, unexpected. She insulted me in my house, and you smoothed your spine. On the other end, silence, then a sigh, low and defeated. I don't want to fight. You already chose your side, Maggie replied, and it wasn't mine. She didn't wait for him to answer. She set the receiver back in its cradle, the sound of plastic striking plastic final enough to echo in the room. The following morning, Maggie sat once again in Edwin Crane's office. The folder lay open between them, its crisp revisions waiting for her signature. Her name was still steady in ink. Scott's and Lindsay's had been struck clean through, legal lines slicing them out of her life. Once you sign, Edwin said quietly, this is final. They'll have no claim to your estate. Maggie picked up the pen, its weight familiar. Good. Let them stand on their own feet for once. She signed with deliberate strokes, sealing the decision that had begun the night Lindsay smirked at her cobbler. Edwin flipped the pages, checked each signature, then slid the folder shut with a soft thump. It's done. Maggie leaned back in her chair, breath leaving her chest as though she'd been carrying weight for years. She expected sorrow or maybe guilt, but what flooded in instead was clarity. That afternoon, she pulled a different set of papers across her kitchen table. Not revisions this time, but beginnings. A proposal drafted with the director of the community center, still rough around the edges. At the top, in bold letters, the Margaret Whittaker Food Education Scholarship. Funded by the eventual sale of her house, the scholarship would pay for classes, kitchen training, and mentorship for local kids who wanted to learn more than what came in a box from the freezer aisle. It was her legacy, baked into the future. Maggie traced her finger over her name at the top, whispering to herself, better this than another mouth that only smirks. By dusk, the house glowed with lamplight. The rolling pin she'd given Sadie was gone, tucked safely where Lindsay couldn't find it. Her recipe books were spread across shelves in the community kitchen, waiting for hands that actually wanted to learn. Her trust papers no longer carried Scott's name. Maggie brewed tea and sat at the dining table, staring at the empty chairs across from her. She could almost hear Lindsay's laugh, brittle and cutting, and Scott's silence bending under it. But she also heard Sadie's voice on the answering machine. I miss cooking with you. The teacup warmed her palms. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by what Lindsay had taken, but by what Maggie had chosen to give away. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a text from Scott. Why would you cut me out? After everything I've done for you. Maggie typed back slowly, every word deliberate. Everything you didn't do weighed more. She hit send, then turned the phone face down. Later that night, when she checked her mailbox, a thin envelope was tucked inside with no return address. She brought it inside, slid it open, and unfolded a single sheet of paper. We know what you're doing. Stop before you regret it. The handwriting wasn't Scott's. Maggie stood in the kitchen, the letter trembling between her fingers. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from something sharper. Confirmation. Lindsay knew. And Lindsay wasn't about to lose quietly. Maggie heard the clatter before she saw her. The unmistakable scrape of cast iron against enamel tile, a sound too heavy to be casual. She stepped from the hallway into the kitchen and froze. Lindsay stood at the counter, both hands gripping Maggie's old skillet, the one blackened from years of frying Sunday chicken and cornbread. It looked wrong in her hands, like a crown stolen in plain daylight. That pan isn't yours, Maggie said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. She stepped closer, her slippers whispering against the floor. Neither is the room. Lindsay startled, then recovered, smirk sliding back into place. Relax, I was just checking the size, for the party. She lifted the skillet slightly, as though weighing it. Maggie shook her head, every inch of her body steady. There is no party, not for you. Not here. For the first time, Lindsay's smile faltered. She set the pan back on the counter with a heavy thud but didn't step aside. Scott said, Scott doesn't decide for me. Maggie's voice didn't rise, but it filled the kitchen in a way Lindsay's never could. You came into my house, insulted me, and thought I'd still hand you everything I built. You were wrong. Lindsay's face flushed, the veneer of charm peeling under the heat. You think you can cut me out of his life? Out of what's owed to us? What's owed? Maggie's laugh was short, humorless. You've already taken enough, but not this. Not anymore. The air grew thick between them, the silence like the still moment before a storm breaks. Leave, Maggie said finally. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, veins taut against her skin. Now, Lindsay tilted her head, eyes narrowing. You don't get to push me out. Scott and I... The front door creaked. Small footsteps padded across the floorboards. Sadie appeared in the doorway, her school backpack still slung over one shoulder. She stopped dead, taking in the sight. Her grandmother rooted at the counter, her mother-in-law standing too close to a pan that didn't belong to her. Sadie's wide eyes flicked from one woman to the other. She didn't say a word. Maggie's chest ached at the sight, but her voice stayed firm. Go upstairs, Sadie. The girl hesitated, then turned slowly, her sneakers squeaking faintly as she climbed the steps. The silence left behind felt even heavier. You've poisoned her against me, Lindsay hissed, her composure cracking. No, Maggie replied, steady as stone. You've shown her who you are. She just believes what she sees. Lindsay's jaw clenched, and for a moment Maggie thought she might throw the skillet across the room. Instead, she spun on her heel, storming toward the door. The sound of her heels striking hardwood echoed sharp and angry. The front gate banged a second later, the slam reverberating through the quiet house like a warning shot. Maggie stood in the kitchen long after the echo faded, her palms flat against the cool countertop. The skillet sat where Lindsay had dropped it, heavy and honest, its black surface reflecting the glow of the overhead light. She touched the handle briefly, then pulled her hand back. For the first time in years, she had no desire to cook in it. Above her, Sadie's bedroom door clicked shut, soft but certain. Maggie exhaled, realizing she hadn't taken a breath since the confrontation began. The house was hers again, for now, but the gate's slam carried a promise. Lindsay wasn't finished, and Maggie knew neither was she. The binder looked heavier than it was. Its thick black cover stretched wide over orderly tabs and neat signatures. Edwin slid it across the polished desk toward her, the motion slow, reverent, like passing scripture. All revisions finalized, he said. This is the copy for you to keep. I'll register everything with the court by tomorrow morning. Maggie smoothed her palm over the cool surface. She had lived her whole life feeding others, but this binder was the first thing she'd made that couldn't be consumed, stolen, or smirked away. Edwin cleared his throat and tapped the summary page. As we discussed, 60% directed to the Food Education Fund, 25% reserved for your granddaughter Sadie, secured with a protected clause until she turns 21, and 15% to the Women's Shelter Kitchen on Broad Street. He paused, glanced at her over his glasses. Scott and Lindsay received nothing. The words didn't sting. They steadied. Maggie nodded once, her mouth set. Edwin hesitated, his pen tapping against the desk. If you'd like, we can record a video statement. Sometimes, in contested estates, it helps to have the testator explain intent in their own words. Could save you friction down the line. Maggie's gaze didn't waver from the binder. No voice needed, she said. My silence is airtight. For a moment, Edwin studied her, perhaps searching for regret, but he found none. He nodded, closed his pen, and slid the folder of originals into his briefcase. Then it settled. Back home, Maggie sat at her dining table with the binder before her. The weight of it grounded her, steadier than any skillet or rolling pin. She paged through each section again, fingers lingering on the lines that named Sadie, the clause that kept Lindsay's hands off her legacy forever. Her kitchen was quiet. The air carried no scent of baking, no hiss of oil on cast iron. Yet she felt full, as though she'd finally eaten after years of hunger. She thought of Sadie's sticky note still pinned to the refrigerator. of the way the girl's eyes had widened when Maggie placed the rolling pin in her hands. The trust wasn't just paper. It was proof Sadie would never stand alone against the kind of silence Maggie had endured from Scott. When the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6, Maggie rose. She slid the binder into a thick envelope and sealed it with a firm press of her thumb. The sound of the flap closing was final, satisfying. At the bank, the vault room smelled faintly of metal and dust. Maggie signed her name on the access log, her handwriting as careful as the strokes on her will. The clerk led her to a long row of safety deposit boxes, the keys jangling faintly. Number 412. Maggie inserted her key, twisted, and opened the drawer. The empty metal slot yawned back at her. She slid the envelope inside, resting it flat against the steel, then closed the drawer with a decisive push. "Would you like a copy for home?" the clerk asked as he locked the box. "No," Maggie said, turning toward the exit. "One is enough." That night, the house seemed to breathe differently. Maggie brewed tea and settled at the window, watching the wind scatter leaves across the yard. Somewhere out there, Lindsay was simmering, plotting, convinced she could bend Maggie back into shape. But Lindsay didn't know the truth, that every line Maggie signed was another lock she couldn't pick. Upstairs, Sadie's bedroom light flicked off, leaving only the glow of Maggie's lamp against the glass. She sipped her tea, calm in the knowledge that she'd built something no smirk could dismantle. A car slowed on the street outside. Its headlights washed across the curtains, lingered a moment too long, then moved on. Maggie set her cup down, her pulse quickening. She realized, with a chill that sharpened her resolve, that her silence might be airtight. But her windows weren't. Inez slid her phone across the cafe table, screen glowing with a screenshot. "Thought you'd enjoy this." Maggie adjusted her glasses. Lindsay's Facebook post filled the screen. A photo of a gleaming kitchen she didn't own, captioned, "Hosting another Whitaker feast." "Tradition runs strong in this family," Inez chuckled, low and dry. "Tradition my foot." She probably burnt water trying to stage that shot. Maggie smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Let her pretend. She'll choke on reality soon enough. They clinked coffee cups and let the laughter settle between them like armor. That Saturday, Maggie carried a tray of warm peach muffins into the community center's multi-purpose hall. The potluck buzzed with voices and clattering pans. She set the tray among crockpots and casserole dishes, the scent of cinnamon and fruit weaving through the air. Mrs. Whitaker, one of the teen volunteers, beamed, reaching for a muffin. "These look amazing." Maggie watched the boy bite into one, his face lighting up. For the first time in weeks, she felt something bloom in her chest that wasn't anger or fear. It was purpose. Food, once a burden in her own house, had become freedom here. As the crowd shifted, she felt a small hand brush hers. Maggie looked down. Sadie stood close, eyes darting to make sure no one else saw. She slipped a folded note into Maggie's palm before darting off toward the dessert table. Maggie unfolded it carefully. "I want to cook with you again someday. S." Her throat tightened. She tucked the note into her pocket, holding on to the quiet promise it carried. That evening, Maggie sat at her typewriter, the rhythmic clack of keys filling the kitchen. She typed slowly, deliberately, each letter striking into permanence. When she was done, she pulled the paper free and folded it neatly into an envelope, addressed in plain block letters, "For Sadie." Inside was a recipe, her peach cobbler, written not in her familiar handwriting, but in type, so Lindsay could never accuse, never trace, never touch. She sealed the envelope and placed it into the same drawer where Sadie's earlier sticky note still lived, safe for the day she could pass it along. On Monday morning, Edwin called. His voice, though calm, carried the clipped cadence of irritation. "She's testing the waters," he said, without preamble. A lawyer from her side sent an inquiry. "Claims Lindsay wants access to your estate plan for review." Maggie's stomach tightened, though her voice stayed steady. "And I replied as plainly as possible, no standing, no claim, no access." his papers shuffled in the background. She has nothing to anchor a suit to, Maggie. You cut them out clean. Your trust is ironclad. Maggie closed her eyes and breathed, tension sliding from her shoulders. Good. Let her waste her money. She will, Edwin said dryly. But it won't buy her what she wants. Later that night, Maggie set another batch of muffins on the counter, the kitchen warm with cinnamon again. For once, she didn't bake for Scott or Lindsay. She baked because the smell made her house feel like her own again. But as she sat with tea cooling in her cup, her gaze drifted to the window. Headlights passed, then slowed. The same car, or maybe another. It lingered just long enough to make her heart quicken. Then it drove on, leaving darkness in its wake. Maggie touched the folded recipe envelope resting in her drawer and whispered to the quiet room. Someday, Sadie. Not yet. But someday. The gate outside creaked faintly, though no one knocked. The answering machine's light blinked red in the dim kitchen. Maggie pressed play. Scott's voice spilled out, heavy with the strain of practiced sorrow. Mom, I know you're upset. Lindsay and we didn't mean for things to get so twisted. I just want us to feel like family again. Call me back, okay? The message ended with a click, leaving the silence thicker than before. Maggie stared at the machine for a long moment, then pressed the delete button. The light went dark. Family. The word tasted sour now. Her refrigerator door told a different story. It was crowded with Polaroids from the community center. A girl grinning over her first loaf of bread. A boy holding a knife correctly for the first time. Inez laughing with flour on her sweater. She tacked each photo beneath a magnet shaped like fruit. Not a single one showed Scott or Lindsay. She hadn't even noticed the absence until now. The door, once cluttered with birthday invitations and school art projects, now displayed only proof of a family she'd chosen. On Sunday morning, Maggie dressed in her blue cardigan and walked to the shelter kitchen with a tray of scones. The women gathered there had already set tables, the scent of coffee mingling with fresh biscuits and bacon donated from the local diner. Morning Maggie, one of them called. We saved you a seat. She joined the circle of women, their laughter filling the room as naturally as sunlight through the windows. Some were residents, some volunteers, some both, but all of them welcomed her without expectation, without smirks. They passed plates, shared stories, and filled cups. Maggie realized halfway through her scone that this felt more like Sunday brunch than anything in her house had in years. Afterward, she moved to the prep table. A row of kitchen knives gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She tapped the counter to call the group closer. First thing, she began, voice steady and clear, a knife is a tool, not a toy. Grip it wrong, and it'll remind you. She demonstrated with the chef's knife. Her fingers curled into a practiced claw. Keep your knuckles forward. Let the blade guide itself. A handful of women leaned in, eyes wide, some nervous, some eager. Maggie handed each a vegetable and coached them through slicing. She corrected grips gently, guiding hands until movements grew steady. The rhythm of chopping carrots soon filled the room, as soothing as a hymn. It was in that rhythm that she noticed her, Sadie. She stood in the back, half hidden near the pantry door, her school hoodie zipped up, hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She wasn't supposed to be here, but her eyes shone, fixed on her grandmother's hands. When Maggie demonstrated again, Sadie mimicked the movement in the air. Invisible knife slicing invisible carrots. Maggie's breath caught, but she said nothing. She only smiled faintly, letting the lesson continue. Her granddaughter's secret presence warming the room in ways no sunlight could. When the class ended, Maggie wiped down her station. Inez stepped beside her, slipping a dish towel across the counter. You look 10 years younger up there, she said softly. Maggie glanced at the women laughing as they packed leftovers into foil trays. Then toward the pantry where Sadie had disappeared before the lesson ended. Her chest tightened, a blend of pride and ache. Leaning closer to Inez, she whispered, "This is what family looks like." The word steadied her more than any signature in Edwin's office had. But when Maggie returned home that evening, the sense of warmth cracked. An envelope sat wedged under her front door. No stamp, no return address. She bent to pick it up, the paper rough against her fingertips. Inside was a single photograph, her kitchen, taken through the window. The shot captured her refrigerator, every Polaroid, every magnet, every chosen face. Maggie's stomach turned cold. Lindsay didn't just know she'd cut them out, she knew exactly who had replaced them. Edwin's letterhead gleamed at the top of the document, the wording clipped and final, response to inquiry. Maggie sat across from him in his office while he read it aloud, his tone dry as dust. Attached as proof of Miss Whitaker's full medical clearance, dated last month. Mental capacity intact. Independent decision-making confirmed. He turned the page. Nina Halloway, notary and witness, has also provided sworn statements of your intent at the time of signing. In plain terms, Maggie, Lindsay has nowhere to go with this. The relief that rippled through her didn't show on her face. She only nodded. Good. Let her choke on silence. Edwin leaned forward, folding his hands. Still, I think it's time we give your voice some permanence, just in case she tries to paint you as manipulated or coerced. That afternoon, Maggie sat in front of Edwin's small camera. The office blinds were drawn, the desk lamp softened to a warm glow. She adjusted the collar of her cardigan, smoothed her skirt, and waited for the red light to blink. My name is Margaret Whitaker, she began, her voice steady, eyes fixed on the lens. Every change I've made to my trust, my will, my directives, every one of them is my decision. I have chosen to give my legacy to the people who treat food, and me with respect. Scott and Lindsay are not among them. Their silence, their contempt, and their entitlement have cost them the right to stand at my table. Her throat tightened, but she held her gaze. What I've written is final. What I've lived explains why. When the recording stopped, Edwin gave her a rare, approving nod. The video was copied to her estate file and labeled with the trust reference, locked alongside her other documents. There, Edwin said, snapping the folder shut. Ironclad. Back at home, Maggie slid a fresh notebook across the kitchen table. The first page was crisp, lined faintly in blue. She uncapped her pen and wrote a title across the top in deliberate strokes. What I kept, what I let go. The words settled like a weight she'd been carrying in her chest for years. She began sketching chapters. The peach cobbler her mother taught her, the lemon pie she'd once baked for Sadie's school fundraiser, the casseroles she swore she'd never make again because they belonged to another life. Each recipe wasn't just food, it was memory, filtered through survival. For hours she wrote, pen scratching against paper, until her kitchen filled with the soft rhythm of pages turning. The phone buzzed against the counter. Maggie reached for it, expecting another of Inez's check-ins, or maybe a reminder from the community center. It was a text from Sadie. Can I visit without them? The words lit the screen, fragile and brave at once. Maggie's chest constricted. She pressed the phone against her palm, torn between joy and dread. If Sadie came here, Lindsay would notice. If she stayed away, the distance might calcify into permanence. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her breath caught. She wanted to type yes so badly her hands ached. But outside, the gate creaked again. A shadow moved across her window. Maggie set the phone down without replying, her pulse hammering. For the first time, she realized Lindsay's eyes might be closer than she thought. The morning light poured into the kitchen, soft and forgiving. For once, Maggie didn't glance toward the window to see if shadows lingered outside. She had dough resting beneath a towel, flour dusting the counter, and a granddaughter at her side. That was enough. Sadie tied an oversized apron around her waist, the strings nearly wrapping twice. Her ponytail stuck out at an angle, and her cheeks already bore a streak of flour. So we're really doing this? She asked, eyes bright. We're really doing this, Maggie said, setting out a rolling pin. Hand pies, simple enough to start, a little harder to master. They rolled, filled, and folded the dough together, fingertips brushing as they sealed the edges with a fork. When one pie split at the seam and filling oozed out, Sadie laughed so hard she nearly dropped it. Maggie laughed too, the sound rising unguarded from her chest. "Don't worry," Maggie said. "The messy ones usually taste better." As the pies baked, the kitchen filled with the scent of peaches and butter. Sadie leaned against the counter, watching the oven door like it was magic. "Next time," she said softly, "I want to learn the sourdough too." Maggie's throat tightened. She reached into the pantry and pulled out a small box she'd been saving. Inside lay a beginner's sourdough set, a banneton basket, a jar for starter, and a worn wooden spoon she'd kept for decades. She placed the box on the counter. "Then you'll need these." Sadie blinked, wide-eyed. "For me?" "For you," Maggie confirmed. "But sourdough requires patience. Not everything rises when you want it to. You have to give it time." Sadie traced her fingers over the wooden spoon, reverent, as though she understood the weight of inheritance. They ate their hand pies on the porch, plates balanced on their laps. The sky stretched wide and cloudless above them, the air tinged with sugar and cinnamon. For once, there was no tension, no rules, just two generations side by side, the silence between them comfortable instead of sharp. Sadie swung her legs against the porch rail, crumbs dotting her hoodie, and smiled through every bite. Maggie looked at her and felt something shift, an ache, but also a certainty. She would not let Lindsay define the girl's inheritance. Not in spirit, not in flour, not in the kitchen. That night, Maggie sat at her desk with Edwin's folder open beside her. She wrote a new clause, neat and deliberate. "Upon my passing, Sadie Whitaker shall have first choice of all kitchen items deemed sentimental, including heirloom cookware and handwritten or typed recipe collections." She slid the page into the binder, her signature steady. It was more than a legal amendment. It was a promise. The next afternoon, Inez dropped by with her camera. "Smile, you two," she said, catching Maggie and Sadie mid-laughter, both with streaks of flour across their cheeks. The shutter clicked, capturing proof that joy had survived, however briefly. When Inez handed Maggie the printed photo later, she pinned it to the refrigerator with a cherry-shaped magnet. It joined the collage of chosen family, a piece of legacy already living in the present. That night, Maggie rinsed the last of the flour from her hands and set the wooden spoon Sadie had touched back into its box. She carried it upstairs, tucking it beneath her bed with the other heirlooms, safe from Lindsay's reach. As she turned off the lamp, the phone rang once, then twice. She froze in the doorway. On the third ring, the caller ID lit up. Private number. Maggie's heart thudded. She knew who it wasn't. She wasn't sure she wanted to know who it was. Edwin's office smelled of ink and cold coffee. Maggie sat across from him as he spread the documents out in neat rows, every page crisp, every margin annotated. His expression carried no panic, only the calm of a man who'd fortified every wall long before the enemy arrived. "They filed," Edwin said. "As expected. Lindsay's petition claims undue influence, coercion, diminished capacity." His tone didn't rise above conversational. "We'll answer with the no contest clause." Maggie nodded once. "If they want to bite, let them taste the steel." Edwin adjusted his glasses and tapped the binder. "They're walking into a trap of their own making. No standing, no claim. They contest it. They lose everything, even if you'd left them scraps." The courtroom was pale wood and fluorescent light, a place stripped of warmth, but Maggie didn't flinch. She sat in the front row beside Inez, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across the aisle, Lindsay shifted in her chair, her lipstick perfect, her eyes sharp and calculating. Scott sat beside her, shoulders slumped, gaze fixed on the floor. The judge listened as Lindsay's lawyer painted his picture. An elderly woman manipulated by neighbors, alienated from her family, coerced into rewriting her estate. Maggie didn't so much as blink. Edwin stood, his papers organized into a single, elegant folder. "Your Honor, we have video testimony," signed medical evaluations confirming full cognitive capacity, and sworn witness statements regarding Ms. Whitaker's intent. His voice never rose, but it filled the room with certainty. There is no manipulation here. There is clarity. There is choice. There is independence. The clerk dimmed the lights. The screen flickered as Maggie's recorded statement played. Her own face filled the courtroom, her own voice steady. What I've written is final. What I've lived explains why. For a moment, the only sound was Lindsay's sharp inhale. Edwin stacked his evidence neatly, every piece aligned like a row of nails in a coffin. The no contest clause is clear. By challenging the trust, they forfeit any residual claim they might have had. Their petition is not only unfounded, it is self-destructive. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. Petition dismissed. The trust stands. His gavel struck once, sharp and echoing. Lindsay's face drained of color. Scott didn't look up at all. Outside the courthouse, the winter air felt softer. Inez looped her arm through Maggie's. You didn't just win. You buried them. Maggie allowed herself the smallest smile. No. I just baked the truth until it held. 2 days later, her kitchen was alive again. She dusted powdered sugar over a tray of lemon squares, the tangy scent filling the air. The verdict party was small, just Inez, a handful of women from the shelter, and 2 of the teenagers who'd learned to dice onions under her watch. They crowded around the table, laughter spilling like champagne bubbles, forks clinking against plates. For the woman who taught us how to hold a knife without fear, one of the women toasted, lifting her glass of cider. And for the woman who proved silence can be stronger than shouting, Inez added. Maggie raised her own glass. For family. The ones we build, not just the ones we're given. They drank, the sweetness of lemon and sugar bright on their tongues. When the last dish was washed and the house grew quiet, Maggie stepped outside to breathe the cool night air. The porch light glowed soft against the driveway. Her eyes caught a splash of color on the concrete. She bent down, fingers brushing over chalk lines drawn in uneven strokes. A heart, large and lopsided. Inside it, written in bright pink, "Love lives here." Her throat caught as she realized who had drawn it. Sadie's handwriting, clumsy but certain. Maggie stood there, palms pressed against her apron, heart swelling and breaking all at once. The driveway felt consecrated, the chalk brighter than any victory inside a courtroom. She looked up, her eyes tracing the shadows at the edge of the yard. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw movement near the hedges. Her joy held steady, but her pulse raced. If Sadie's chalk had marked her house with love, it had also marked it as a target. The papers lay on Edwin's desk like a final blueprint. Maggie traced her finger down the clause that mattered most. Charitable remainder trust. At the time of your passing, Edwin explained, the house transfers fully into the foundation. The kitchen becomes part of the mentorship program. Its income funds the scholarship. You'll still live here until then, undisturbed. Maggie nodded. So the house stops being their battleground. It becomes something else entirely. Her voice held no tremor. The home that had hosted years of laughter and years of silence would not die with her. It would outlive her as something better. By spring, the plans were public. The local paper ran a headline, Whitaker Home to Become Culinary Mentorship Center. Maggie clipped the article, folded it neatly, and slid it into her cookbook draft. The remodel began with a sketch. Wide counters for teaching, bright tile backsplash, rows of knives locked safely for training sessions. At the center, in brass letters set into the hearthstone, the Margaret Wells Memorial Hearth. Her maiden name, her truest name, etched in permanence. Not Whitaker, not his, certainly not Lindsay's. When the plaque was delivered, Maggie ran her fingers across the engraving, cool metal against her skin. She imagined Sadie, grown, walking into the remodeled kitchen and reading it aloud. Her name, her kitchen, her choice. At night, Maggie finalized her cookbook. What I kept, what I let go, filled with pages of recipes laced with memory. Some she preserved exactly, her mother's cobbler, Inez's lemon pie. Others she wrote only as stories, the food itself discarded, too tainted by years of resentment. She pressed Polaroids between the pages, Sadie's first hand pie, the community center's carrot chopping class, Inez mid-laugh with flour on her nose. Each photo anchored the recipes in something more than instructions. They were proof of survival, plated with care. One evening, as she slid old albums from the hall closet, she stopped on a photograph of Scott as a boy, sticky grin across his face, holding a dripping ice cream cone. The next page carried his wedding photo, Lindsay's smile wide and polished. Maggie stared at it for a long moment, then pulled it free. She removed every photo with their faces, stacking them in a shoebox. They would not be burned. Destruction wasn't her legacy, but neither would they live in her storybooks. They were history now, boxed and closed. When she returned to the kitchen, the albums lay slimmer, lighter. She filled their empty sleeves with new snapshots. Sadie's chalk heart on the driveway, the brunch circle at the shelter, the sourdough basket waiting for dough. Later, Maggie unfolded a yellow legal pad and began writing instructions for her funeral. She wrote them without sentiment, only clarity, closed circle, no outside invitations. Attendance limited to those named in trust. No speeches, no theatrics. Keep it small, keep it clean. She underlined one line twice, Scott and Lindsay excluded. As she capped her pen, she felt no cruelty, only relief. Death would not be their stage. The kitchen clock ticked past midnight. Maggie sat alone at the table, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Her cookbook draft rested beside the brass plaque still wrapped in brown paper. For the first time, she realized her house was already slipping into the future, a future she had chosen, not inherited. She rose, pressing her palm against the refrigerator door, over Sadie's pink chalk note, now laminated and pinned under glass. "I'm leaving you a kitchen," she whispered into the quiet, as though Sadie could hear her. Outside, a car slowed again at the curb. Its headlights cut across the living room wall, paused, then dimmed as the engine clicked off. This time, the car didn't drive away. The oven timer chimed, soft as a bell. Maggie slid out the tray of biscuits, steam rising in buttery clouds. On the stove, eggs scrambled slow and fluffy in the cast iron pan. The cobbler sat cooling on the counter, its sugared crust blistered golden. For the first time in years, the kitchen smelled like comfort, without the shadow of performance, no eyes judging, no smirk waiting. She set the table with mismatched china, each plate rimmed with tiny chips that felt like proof of survival rather than flaws. A vase of daisies, clipped fresh from Inez's yard, leaned in the center. The doorbell rang, and when Maggie opened it, warmth spilled inside. Sadie stepped through first, carrying a notebook tucked under her arm, her grin quick and unguarded. Behind her came Inez, holding a jar of homemade jam, and 3 women from the shelter program, Rosa, Denise, and Marla, each balancing foil-covered dishes. "Mornin', Maggie," Rosa said, her smile bright. "It smells like heaven in here." "Just biscuits and eggs," Maggie replied, waving them toward the table. "Nothing fancy." "Nothing fancy is exactly what I needed," Denise said, sliding into a chair. They ate slowly, passing plates, biscuits torn open and slathered with butter and jam, eggs spooned onto china that clinked against the table. The cobbler came last, peaches melting into sweetness, spoons scraping until only syrup pooled at the bottom of the dish. The laughter was steady, easy, filling every quiet corner of the house. Marla told a story about her first disastrous attempt at chili. Rosa teased Inez about her camera habit, and Denise clapped her hands at a joke Sadie whispered under her breath. For once, Maggie didn't hover or apologize. She ate, she laughed, she let the noise swell. Halfway through, Sadie pulled out her notebook. I've been working on something, she said, cheeks pink. A recipe idea. The table hushed, giving her space. She opened to a page covered in careful handwriting and small doodles of whisks and spoons. It's a cobbler, but with raspberries instead of peaches, and lemon zest in the crumble. I wanted to try it with you, Grandma. Maggie's chest swelled, too full to speak for a moment. She reached across the table, laid her flour-dusted hand on Sadie's. That sounds perfect. We'll try it together. Sadie's smile lit the room brighter than any lamp. When the plates were cleared and the women lingered over second cups of coffee, Maggie slipped into the corner of the room with her leather-bound journal. She opened to a fresh page and wrote slowly, the pen scratching steady against paper. Some meals aren't meant for blood. Some meals are meant for love, for laughter, for those who show up with open hands, not grasping ones. She underlined the last sentence, then closed the book. At the table, no one mentioned Scott. No one mentioned Lindsay. Their absence was as natural as it was welcome, like air cleared after a storm. When the women left, the house held echoes of their laughter, dishes stacked clean, the scent of biscuits lingering in the air. Sadie hugged her grandmother tight before stepping off the porch, her notebook clutched to her chest. I'll bring the raspberries next time, she whispered. Maggie kissed the top of her head. Next time. That evening, when the house was quiet again, Maggie carried her journal upstairs. She placed it beside the finished cookbook, the plaque, the binder. The legacy felt whole, plated with care. But as she turned back toward the window, her breath caught. Across the street, a car sat idling, its headlights off, its silhouette crouched low. It didn't move when she pulled the curtain. The brunch had tasted like freedom. But freedom was exactly what Lindsay couldn't digest. Maggie opened her leather-bound recipe binder, the one she'd carried for decades. Its spine groaned, its pages yellowed, corners softened from flour-dusted fingers and years of spills. She flipped past cobblers and pies, soups and stews, every margin scribbled with notes. Too much sugar, double the cinnamon. Sadie liked this one. At the very back, she slid in a fresh page. Her handwriting, steady and unshaken, stretched across the top. To Sadie, when it's time. She paused, pen hovering, then underlined it once. The binder shut with a soft thump, her palm pressing against its cover as if sealing something far heavier than paper. The latch clicked. Final. Outside. Twilight colored the garden in muted gold. Maggie walked the stone path slowly, her apron brushing against her knees. She stopped by the rosemary bush, now sprawling, evergreen, against the fence. You've outlasted everything, she whispered, pinching a sprig. The scent burst sharp against her skin, earthy and alive. She rubbed it between her fingers, letting the oils linger, then bent close, breathing in. The bush had seen seasons of joy, of silence, of tension. It was still here, and so was she. She turned back toward the house, its windows glowing against the deepening sky. In the kitchen, Maggie pulled peaches from the basket, butter from the fridge, sugar from the jar. Her movements were precise, reverent. Knife against cutting board, flour against wood, the rhythm steady. She rolled dough, sprinkled cinnamon, folded fruit into sweetness. As the cobbler baked, steam fogged the glass, curling through the house. She leaned against the counter, eyes closing, letting the scent wrap around her like an old song. When it cooled, she slid the dish into the freezer, sealed it in foil, then pressed a label across the top. One more slice, just for love. Her fingers lingered on the ink. This cobbler wasn't for Scott, wasn't for Lindsay, wasn't for judgment or performance. It was a gift for the future, her way of leaving sweetness behind. Back at her desk, she pulled a cream card from the drawer. Her pen moved slowly, carefully, every word deliberate. If you show up, feed someone. If you mock it, starve. She signed her name in looping cursive, folded the card, and slipped it into the safe. One by one, she added the binder marked for Sadie, the finished cookbook, the plaque etched with her maiden name, the funeral instructions written clear and cold. On the outside, she taped a note in tidy block letters. Emergency contact. Inez Hall. Access upon my passing. The dial spun under her hand. The safe locked with a final, satisfying clunk. Upstairs, Maggie paused at the mirror. Her reflection wore the apron she'd tied on that morning, streaked with flour, pockets dusted white. A smudge dotted the tip of her nose. She laughed quietly, shaking her head. Not the bitter laugh of dismissal, but something warmer, something lighter. The woman in the mirror looked back at her steady, softened, unbroken. She wasn't erased. She wasn't silenced. She was exactly who she chose to be. Apron tied, hands strong, legacy intact. For the first time in years, Maggie smiled without hesitation. The house was quiet when she returned to the kitchen. The clock ticked, even and patient. She sat at the table, the same place where laughter had once cracked and silences had once stung. The same place Lindsay's smirk had poisoned years of meals. She leaned forward, whispering into the quiet, her words rolling like a recipe measured too carefully to forget. My daughter-in-law smirked. Stay out of the kitchen, you old parasite. Her eyes swept the shelves, the freezer with its final cobbler, the refrigerator pinned with Sadie's chalk heart, the safe locked with everything she'd built. So I cooked her right out of my legacy,